Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with Developer University. For more of my training videos for beginners, please visit me at devu.com. In this lesson, I want to show how to define and call simple methods. And we use the term method as an umbrella term, at least at this point, to talk about both subroutines and functions. We've been using them up to this point, but how do we create our own? Well, that's what we're going to learn about in this lesson. So creating methods will help us in a number of different ways. First of all, they'll help us to better organize our code, and you'll see that here in just a moment. Secondly, they help to eliminate duplicate code, and it eliminates the need to copy and paste the same chunk of code multiple times, and I'll talk about the dangers of copy and paste in this lesson. But methods also allow us to encapsulate a specific feature of our application in one method, and this makes that feature reusable across our entire application. And depending on how we package it, it could make it reusable across multiple applications, but that's kind of an advanced topic. And then finally, whenever we need to update that one feature of our application, instead of looking all over our source code for everywhere that we copied and pasted that code, all we got to do is change it in that one place where we define that functionality. And all we do is just make our change in that one spot, and then every place in our code where we call into that method, it will gain the benefit of those changes that have been made. So there's a lot of benefits to using methods. It's actually one of the most important building blocks as you're building larger and larger applications. So it's definitely something we need to get under our belt. And just remember that a method, whether it's a sub or a function, it's simply a block of code that is given a name. So if it's a sub, it's going to be sub, whatever my name is, end sub. Or if it's a function, it's going to be function, whatever my name is, end function. And so whenever you go to, since it has a name, you can call it by its name in order to invoke the code defined inside of that code block. All right. So we would call whatever my name is, or whatever I called it a moment ago. All right. So again, it's one of the most important building blocks as we're getting started here for building larger applications. Okay, so this is one of the times where I'm going to ask you to make sure you download the code associated with this lesson. Here I have a before and after folder for this particular lesson, and I want you to grab the contents of the before folder, which should be called, which is a solution and a project called Simple Method. I'm going to copy that, and what I want to do is put it in my projects folder. Now, instead of navigate to my project folder every time, what I did was I dragged and dropped the folder reference to this quick access area here inside of the File Explorer. So now if I want to get to my projects folder, I just click projects there, and then I can simply right click and paste in my folder. And now I can double click and open up the solution file, and we can begin our work inside. And so basically what this lesson is just a little name game, and let's go ahead and play it so you can see how it works. This is going to ask me a series of questions like, what is my first name? What's my last name? And then where was I born? I was born in Oak Park, Illinois. And then it'll take each of those, Bob and Tabor, and then Oak Park, and it will reverse them and then print them to screen. Okay, so this is using the algorithm that we learned about when we looked at character arrays in the previous lesson. We're just going to use it multiple times, and this will make it a great candidate for extracting out some of that code and putting it into methods. So as you can see here, the code that actually implements that little name game is actually pretty hairy. What we wind up doing is re-implementing the same code a number of times in order to do that reverse string algorithm. So I'm doing it once for the first name, once for the last name, and once for the city. And so we're essentially, here's the first name, last name, and city. Here's the first name, the last name, and the city. All right, so you can get the feeling that we've reinvented the wheel a couple of times here, and that is an opportunity for us to improve the quality of our code. What we want to do is reduce the duplicate code in our application, first of all. And duplicate code in and of itself, there's really nothing wrong with it. There's no way that you can completely remove duplicate code from your application, but duplicate code is usually the result of copy and paste. And so invariably what will happen is you say, well, I need to reverse not only the first name, but I also need to reverse the last name. So let me copy and paste from up here, and I'll paste it down here. And invariably what happens is you forget to change maybe the variable name from first name to last name, or whatever the case might be. And so you subtly introduce a bug into your application that you got to hunt down and figure out. But furthermore, if you have the same code repeated many times, then whenever changes are requested in your application, you're going to need to go and find every time you've implemented that particular feature of your application and change it in multiple spots. And that will lead to subtle bugs as well, because chances are you're not going to find every implementation of that given feature. But if we were to be able to step back and say to ourselves, I'm really doing the same thing 3 times, and extract out those things that are common across all 3 of those implementations. So the little algorithm that is required to, convert a string into an array of characters, to reverse it, and then combine it back together. If we were to take that and extract that out and then leave in the only things that are different about each of the implementations. I'm going to use it for a first name. I'm going to use it for a last name. I'm going to use it for a city. Well, now you've got this nice separation. I can take all of the code related to reversing the array and put it into its own method, and then I can call into it 3 times, just passing in what's different as an input parameter to that method. All right. So the second reason that you'll want to actually break up your application into methods is to simplify the readability of your code. So if there are several lines of code that do the exact same thing, you're going to find that your code is less readable. So as I'm looking at this code and I'm trying to understand what it's doing here, it's just got a lot of thick code that I have to mentally parse through to understand, okay, I see what they're doing there. All right, I see what they're doing there. I see what they're doing there. I see what they're doing there. Wouldn't it be easier if I just took out all of the code that knows how to reverse an array and put it into a method called reverse array or reverse string, or, reverse string. That would be a good name for the method. And now I can just look at that name, reverse string. It's nice and friendly. It encapsulates all the functionality required, all the code required to reverse the string. And now as I'm reading through my code, it becomes very obvious what this application is attempting to do because I've made my code much more readable. So you should strive to make your code human readable. Make it read as much like an English story as possible. And one of the ways you do that is by choosing good names for your variables and for your methods. And you want to tell a story as you're going through that main section of your code that calls into the different methods to do all of its dirty work. Okay. So you should strive to make your code human readable. It'll make it easier for you 6 months from now when you look at your code again. It'll make it easier for your teammates who you've asked to help you maintain the code. And it will also make you look like you really know what you're talking about. So maintenance and maintaining code is a big deal. And whether it's you maintaining your own code or other people maintain your code or you maintaining other people's code, there's a form of communication that has to go on. And part of that communication is the words you choose to use and the way you spell things and the conventions that you use. All right. So code readability, super huge in order to reduce the friction of understanding what code is supposed to be doing as you're building your applications. Okay, so what I want to do is introduce a few methods and try to reduce the complexity of this application. So what I'll do to begin with here is start off by maybe taking something really simple like taking this, for example, and moving it into its own method. So I could, for example, create a sub called display result, and inside of here, let me just say I want to pass in a message as type string. So now we have an input parameter, one input parameter, and we're going to let the user pass in what needs to be displayed out to the end user. So here I might do something like console.write results colon space and then console.write, and in this case just the message. All right, that's pretty easy, and we can easily just replace this line of code with this display result. I don't know that we've made a huge improvement to our code. However, it is obvious what it is that we're trying to do now. By making our code more readable, we're displaying the end result. All right, small improvement, but really the key here is how do you define your own methods? Use, in this case, a subroutine. A subroutine is different from a function. It basically is fire and forget. I want you to execute, and then I don't want to hear back from you again. Go do your work, and then quietly end your execution. So we also see now how to define a parameter. In this case, we're defining a very simple parameter. It is just a string that we're passing in, and this allows us now to use IntelliSense. As we add the opening and closing parentheses, you can see that we get this message of what's expected. We're expected to pass in a string called the message, and so we then can just type in the result and it'll satisfy that. All right, so that's one version of this method, but that method's not all that useful. What might be more useful is if we were to do something like this: sub display result, and you can see that, and we're spending a lot of time here just kind of concatenating strings together. So this and equal is just taking the current value of result and adding the current item to it. So I know you probably haven't seen that before, but that's what it's doing there. I think we can simplify and remove just like all of this code by just creating a more clever version of display result. So, for example, we could give it the reversed first name as string, the reversed last name as string, and then the reversed city as string. Okay. All right. Now, there's a couple of things here. The first thing that you see is that all of these input parameters that we've defined are separated by commas. So in this case, we have one input parameter, we're accepting one string, and in this case, we're accepting 3 strings, separated by commas. All right. I may want to move these to separate lines because, frankly, it's a little bit annoying to have to move off to the side of the screen. Notice in this case, I didn't have to use the line continuation character whenever we're defining or calling methods, and we want to put those methods parameters on separate lines just to kind of line them all up and make them all kind of nice and compact as opposed to just moving off the side screen. We don't have to use the line continuation character. So that's a huge score for us. All right, so the next thing that we'll want to do then is do something like this. In fact, here, I'm just going to copy this. And in this case, we'll just go and instead of using one replacement code, I'm going to use 3 replacement codes. So instead of just using the curly brace, open and close curly brace, and then 0, I'm going to use also open and curly brace, close curly brace 1, open and close curly brace 2. And then I can pass in all of the things that I want pushed into that format. So, for example, reversed first name, comma, reversed last name, comma, and then reversed city, comma, like so. And here again, I don't have to suffer with my code running off to the right-hand side of the screen. I can just go ahead and hit enter on the keyboard to move them down to the next line. And now, even though this does take up a lot of lines of code, they're really just parameters that have been moved to the next line. All right. So it's really just, 4 lines of code as opposed to what I have here, about 8 lines of code. Okay, and the next thing you might be wondering is how in the world did we name our new method the same as our old method? What we did was we created an overloaded version of our method. So you can create more than one definition for a method. Now look what happens in IntelliSense. Whenever I type in display result and use the open parenthesis, you'll notice that IntelliSense will show me that I have two versions of this method. The first one accepts one string as an input parameter, but if I use the down arrow on my keyboard, or the down arrow in this case, on the little IntelliSense pop-up, then you can see that there's a second version of this method which will allow me to pass in three different strings, the reversed first name, last name, and city. Okay, so why would you ever want to create three different versions of the same method? Typically, you want to create multiple versions of a method if you're creating a framework that other people will use. You can even do it for your own use. If you need to be able to call a given method in several different ways, depending on the usage or the purpose. It doesn't really make sense in this case because, this application is so small, I could really just go and delete this first version if it wasn't for the fact that I was just trying to teach you how to create an overloaded method. Now, the key to creating overloaded methods is this. The method signature must be different for each overloaded version of your method. And a method signature is the number and the data type of the input parameters that are accepted as input parameters to the method. So in this case, we have one input parameter of type string. In this case, we have three input parameters of type string. We could create another version of display result that had message as integer and Visual Basic would be just fine with that. Why? Because the method signature is different. Even though we have one input parameter, their data types are different. Okay? But what we can't do is this. We can't say other message. All right. Now in this case, we're going to get an error. And you can see as we hover over, it says that it has multiple definitions with identical signatures. Well, but wait a second. I named this message and I named this other message. The method signature has nothing to do with what you name the input parameter, only the number of parameters and the types of each of the parameters. So these are essentially the same method signature, even though we are using a different name for the input parameter. Okay, let me delete all that. All right, so that's a overloaded method. This forces us now to rethink how we actually are calling our code here. So I'm going to be able to delete like all of these lines of code here, all of these lines up to that point. Okay, and what I'll do is just call display result. I'm going to use the new overloaded version of it by using the down arrow on my keyboard to give me that little guidance there. And so the first thing is called, I think, first name array, and then last name array, and then city array, like so. Now I don't think we're going to get the satisfaction from this that we want, but let me try and see what this looks like just now before we go too far. Okay, and it actually does work. We don't have to do anything else. How does it work? Well, fortunately, console.writeLine is smart enough to take just about anything we throw at it. And it doesn't know how to deal with an array of characters, but it sure does know how to take an array of characters and how to flip it around and display it as a string, so we don't have to do the for next at all, fortunately. Now, we could go the extra mile if we really needed to and do something like string concatenate or concat. And what that would simply do is just take each individual element of the array and add it together. But again, fortunately, in this particular case, console.writeLine does this for us, and we don't need to do that. Now, the funny thing about console.write and console.writeLine, if you take a look at their definition, there's 19 overloaded versions of WriteLine. So again, it will take just about anything you give to it. You can see that the fourth version of it will take character arrays. And so that's essentially what we've given it. We've given it that string, but we've also given it character arrays. It knows how to deal with it. Okay. That's because somebody nice at Microsoft said, it might be useful if we gave overloaded versions of console.write so that no matter how you call it, it will actually do what you think it will. So look how much code we've been able to eliminate by just by being a little smarter about creating a method and then passing in the appropriate values. Okay, but we still have to clean up some of this initial stuff here. We're actually collecting these values. And so what I want to do next is actually create another method. And this time what I want to do is create a function. And a function is just like a subroutine, but a subroutine will fire and then end quietly, but not a function. A function will end and return back a value. So for example, let's just call this get reverse string, like so. And we'll type in message as string, and we're going to expect a string to be returned from this function. So notice we've defined our input parameter, but we've also defined the data type that we would expect as a return value when we call get reverse string. So inside of this code block here, this function, we can do something like this. So dim message array is char array equals message dot to char array, character array, array dot reverse, using that message array we just got our hands on. And then what we want to do is return string dot concat, like we just learned about, and give it the message array. And that should, again, take all of the individual characters and munge them together back into a string. We're going to return that string back to the caller. All right, so let's see how that's going to affect what we're doing here. This really gets pretty simple at this point. We don't have to, and we've already eliminated some of this application, but we can get rid of, yeah, pretty much all of this code right here, these 6 lines of code. Get rid of that. And what we can do is just wrap get reverse string around the console.readline, like that. How crazy is that, right? So get reverse string, passing in a string, whatever's returned from readline, and we'll save it here in last name. Get reverse string. Now we're going to need to change these input parameter names to first name, last name, and city instead of what they were formerly named as, because we already did some of the work outside of our display result. And now look at this. We've really pared this down to just a few lines of code, and we can easily see what the code is attempting to do. We're going to grab whatever the user types in and reverse it, and then display that to the screen. And so now it's starting to read a little bit more like a paragraph. And we can see that it still works, hopefully. Let's test it to make sure. And it does. Awesome. Okay. But before we say that this is finished, what I want to do is create one more version of this reverse string just for kicks. Now, what we've been doing up to this point is just passing an input parameter with using the default technique, which is something called by value, which means that whatever we pass in here will actually just be a copy of the actual value that gets passed into our method. But what if we wanted to actually make a change to a variable itself? In other words, what I mean by that is we create a subroutine called subReverseString. And instead of just passing in the message as string, we'll say, tell you what, instead of just giving us a copy of the value, so in other words, just instead of giving us Bob or Tabor, the value, give me the actual memory location where I'm storing the value Bob or the value Tabor. Give me the memory location, the bucket in the computer's memory. I want to manipulate the data in that bucket. All right. So I know that's kind of an odd way of looking at it, but here we're just passing and saying, oh, Yeah, the value that we've gotten back is Bob or Tabor. But in this case, what we're saying is I want to actually have a link to that location in the computer's memory, and I'll manipulate that directly from my reverse string subroutine. All right, so to make this work, we're going to have to redo our code a tiny bit. Specifically here, and we'll just change this around a tiny bit. Instead of calling get reverse string right there, let's get rid of it. I'm going to call it, we'll call reverse string right there as we're making the call in. Now you can see I'm going to get some problems here because this does not return a string. So I'm going to do it a little bit differently than that even. All right. And this will add some lines of code, but I just want to show you the difference between by value and by ref. So let's take, let's go reverse string, and we're going to pass in first name, reverse string last name, and then reverse string city. Okay. All right. So here, what we'll do is instead of the default, which is by val, we'll say instead, give me a reference. So I'm going to say pass me in by reference. So this will give me an actual connection to the variable first name or last name or city in the computer's memory, and now I can manipulate that directly. Okay, and so I'll just do dim message array as char array equals message dot to char array, like so. Whoops, and then array dot reverse message array, and that should be all I need to do because this message, whoops, I think I need to do one more thing, which is string.concat. Actually, message equals string.concat message array, like that. Okay, that should work. See how we're going to manipulate the value of message, but we're not returning anything? That's because we're actually manipulating the value up in the bucket. So now let's run the application, and it still works. Okay, pretty cool. So we learned quite a bit in this lesson. Now, before we kind of wrap up here, on Developer University, I issue a decree to students, and that is that no method should have more than 6 lines of code in it. If it has more than 6 lines of code, it's probably trying to do too much in the system. Now, of course, rules are meant to be broken, but as a rule of thumb, this 6-line rule will keep your code nice and tidy and readable. Now, I've broken that rule here only because I'm trying to illustrate some ideas, but ideally, we would compact this down and make this much smaller. Creating more smaller methods is preferable to creating one monolithic method with just a ton of code inside of it. So we want to create lots of small methods, create methods with good names, and let those methods drive the storyline of the application as it unfolds, as it's executing. Okay. But in this lesson, we looked at how to define our own methods, creating subroutines, which fire and then end quietly, versus functions which fire but return something of a given data type, and we declare that with the as data type name at the end of the function. We looked at creating input parameters, and we looked at creating multiple input parameters. We looked at creating overloaded versions of methods by creating methods with different method signatures, and a method signature is simply the number and the type of input parameters for a given method. We looked at how it looks like from a consumption standpoint when we use IntelliSense to show us the different versions of our methods. We looked at passing values into methods using both by val, which is the default, we're just passing the value of the bucket in, making a copy of it essentially and passing it, versus by ref where we're saying, actually, let me deal with the bucket directly like we did here so that I can manipulate exactly what's in memory. So when I'm reversing those strings, I'm reversing first name. It started off as Bob, or Tabor would be a better example, and ends up as Robat, so that when we're displaying the result, it'll be actually manipulated by the point we get to that line number 20. Okay, and even though we've added a lot of extra code here, we really did not dramatically expand the number of lines of code. Notice we only went from like 50 to 53. A lot of this can be stripped out, right? So we could have completely reduced this code down to just a handful of lines of code. Very cool. Now, if we ever need to manipulate how the reverse string algorithm works, we just change it one little spot. If we ever want to change how the code is displayed, we change it one little spot, and we're done. Okay. All right, hopefully that all made sense, and hopefully you're starting to get a sense of what it means to write your code correctly, to make it readable, maintainable, to think and have a strategy for your code. Maybe rules of thumb that help you to keep the scope of the code on a per method basis down as small as possible. Nice and tidy, nice and understandable, nice and readable. Okay, so that's pretty much, that wraps up this topic. We'll continue on the next lesson. We'll see you there. Thanks.